Welcome, and thank you for joining me for today's exploration into Orphan Trains, completing the reset. The objective of today's exploration is to consider the role the Orphan Trains played in the last reset. New viewers of the channel may not be familiar with the 5 eras theory. The channel has several theories for the existence of the Old World and Tartaria, and this is one of the theories that we consider the most plausible, the 5 eras theory. Breaking down the entirety of human existence into 5 distinct eras that were separated by hard resets. The Golden Age comprising the first 3 eras, and then the Tartarian Age, or the age that preceded ours, whatever you want to call it, the civilization that we believe was across all the lands that came before us. Then we had a hard reset, and the year on that hard reset we debate. Was it 1850, 1800, and 1750? And that brought us into our contemporary age, or the current time frame that we have many unique and creative names for, such as the age of plastic, the age of disposability, and the age of many different alluring historical narratives. What we're looking at here, though, is the time frame immediately following 1850, which is when we believe the last reset occurred. And we're going to look specifically at how that reset was implemented. It looks like there were 3 distinct approaches that were used: conflict, assimilation, indoctrination, and typically in that chronological order. And in fact, even to this day, we see conflict, assimilation, and indoctrination. The 19th century was rife with conflict, to include the United States Civil War, the Crimean War, and yet you can look and see many other conflicts. After conflict, which seemed to be targeting the remnants of the enclave population, the survivors of the previous civilization, we had assimilation, and that was where everyone found their proper roles in this new civilization after the reset. And then finally you had indoctrination. And indoctrination was ensuring that people had the proper thoughts and that they would never question what had happened. We have many pictures from this time frame that tend to pose more questions than they answer, as though there was some sort of strange massive expedition that was going on across all the lands to pacify what remained of a population. Now, we're told that these are legitimate conflicts, and the historical narrative tells us there was a civil war going on in the United States, there was the Crimean War going on, and so many other conflicts that you can look up yourself that completely dot the landscape of the 19th century, or the timescape as it were as well. It's an intriguing consideration, and yet we see other signs of it that show that there may be much more going on than we're aware in the historical narrative. The United States Civil War is often examined because of the conflicting accounts that we have in what occurred in the Civil War. Oftentimes we have pictures that don't match the narrative that we're given, or create more questions than they answer. For example, we're told time and time again that the United States military, or the Union, was segregated during the Civil War, and yet you see many different pictures that paint a different narrative. Now, were these pictures that were taken for purposes of displaying the political message at that time, and could they have been supporting the war effort as we were told in the historical narrative? Of course. However, there's just too many of them to simply ignore, and we have to wonder if there was something much greater going on, and that the nature of the conflict, and there's no doubt there was a very significant conflict that occurred, and not just in the United States and in the United States Civil War, but in all these conflicts across all the lands. We have to wonder what the true objective of the conflict is. And one of the channel's primary theories is that this conflict was targeting the remnants of the enclave population that had survived the last reset. People that they knew that were not going to go along with the reset and not drop what the truth was in favor of a new historical narrative. We have strange pictures like this that are supposedly from the United States Civil War, where we see large rabbles of people. We'll be told that this is some sort of formation for a militia. But when you look at this image, does this really give you the inclination that this is a militia? Or is there something else going on here? And we have the strange individual there with the top hat. This doesn't appear to be a military formation. It's very odd. You could have any kind of explanation for this photo. Is this a group of refugees going somewhere? Is this a group of people that are being moved from point A to point B against their will? None of the faces look particularly happy. This doesn't look like a group of people that are a militia or they're going off to defend their homeland against some existential threat. We also think about the role that Asylums played in the assimilation and indoctrination aspect of the conflict, assimilation, and indoctrination. Earlier, the channel theorized the goals of the Kirkbride Plan, which was the plan behind asylums in the United States, but there were asylums across all the lands to ensure the population adhered to the reset. This was their way to ensure that people properly assimilated and they were indoctrinated. And if they were not, they were sent to the asylum, where they would live out their lives. It also supported the dual purpose of being able to explain the presence of isolated large facilities that didn't make sense. We even had special soldier asylums for soldiers who may have served in this conflict of suppressing the enclaves that remained from the previous civilization, and they were unwilling to accept the narrative that they were given after the conflicts were completed. So they had special asylums to send them off as well too. Now again, this is a theory. This could well be that it's just the historical narrative as we're told. But there's far too much evidence and far too many conflicts in the story to simply ignore it. And now we have to look at how the orphan trains played a role in this. We're given many accounts that there were just simply roving bands of children, especially in New York City. And we're told that this was because there were many children born out of wedlock. This is an interesting account because at the same time we're also told that culture in the United States was very different. That religion played a large role, and morality played a role within the family. We have to wonder when we see these kind of images, did these children really come from out of wedlock? Or were they the survivors, the remaining children of the families whose parents were killed in the conflict? Those families that were the final survivors of the previous civilization who refused to recognize the authority of the new civilization after the reset. It's a very intriguing premise, and we have to wonder, was that their story? We consider the concepts of diaspora and dysphoria. Diaspora being the concept of spreading a people from their homeland and removing their identity, and dysphoria, taking away their sense of adventure in life. Children without homes. It's a very noble aspiration. It's very altruistic. We're told that these children were simply compiled in New York City and that there were so many of them in roving bands that they didn't have their parents and they were simply orphans and they needed to be cared for. They needed to have families. So you can look up the grand plan that we had in our official historical narrative that there was simply a religious figure, a young minister named Charles Loring Brace, who became concerned with the plight of these street children and enacted a plan to where they were going to be transferred to states and families where they could be given wondrous families. Interestingly enough, the numbers that we have for how many were victims of this plan, or perhaps we should say those who benefited from the plan, because that's what we'll be told by the historical narrative, we have to wonder, what was the true number? We're told it was 250,000, but how many was it really? Numbers are always something that seems to be up for debate, and even our casualty figures from the United States Civil War seems to be a very fluid number. That varies depending on what. Of course, we discuss the altruistic nature of this endeavor, and it seems like it's something benevolent and would serve a good purpose. Although it should be noted that the transportation of children away from their parents is something that's occurred time and time again. For example, in World War II during the Blitz of London, where we have children that were taken away from their parents and sent away, ostensibly for their safety. In fact, the film The Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, the Wardrobe begins in this manner, where the children are taken away to escape the bombing. It's a very mainstream image that reminds us of what happened in the past. It also reminds us that this approach continues, this approach of seeming to want to separate families. Is it something that merely occurs because of events beyond our control? Or is it something much more insidious? Part of a planned, controlled narrative in which we attempt to attack every aspect of an individual's identity. And we start with the most basic, with the family. We look at the images and the concept of the orphan train going back to the United States, and we're told that its success depended on the altruistic nature, the generosity of the farmers, and the mercantilists that these children were being taken to. It's an interesting prospect in the fact that these children were supposedly part of roving bands in New York City, or that they were simply overwhelming the system there, and they needed to be moved to a place to where they could be used. The other aspect, we're told, is that there were vast labor shortages across the Midwest and in other states. And we see these images which show this being a very successful program and everyone benefited from it. The families or the businesses looking to put children to work, and the children were given a place to live, potentially a family, and 3 square meals a day and a roof over their head. But was it really that benevolent? Was that really the intention behind it? We see these images and we remember how images can tell a different narrative than what the story that we're given is. We have to wonder, is there something much more insidious behind all this? The question I have is, if there was such a labor shortage across these states, and we'll take a look at a map here in a moment, then why did they need children to fill these labor shortages? Even if your only goal was simply to provide labor and provide efficient labor, it would certainly make more sense to have adults. And I'm told by numerous viewers that there were many people who simply had to work or they would die. And that's why there were so many laborers to do construction jobs. Well, what about agriculture? Isn't it also important to provide food to feed people? They seem to overlook that little fact that they claim there were labor shortages in the Midwest. Labor shortages that can only be filled by children. Interestingly enough, and not just in the farm fields, but in the mills and the plants and whatever baseline manufacturing that we had at that time. A lot of these images are considered shocking today. Of course, there's also the more benign aspect of growing up on a farm and you're part of a family and you work on a farm. Is it really terrifying labor, or are you just doing your chores and you're learning responsibility? It's true. However, you look at this from a grander perspective and you realize this goes beyond the simple concepts of child labor. You see that what's really happening is these children did have families. And we also find instances where there were multiple phases of the orphan trains. The initial orphan trains that ran in 1850 through 1870 seemed to be taking care of the kids that no longer had any parents. And after that, we saw repeat occurrences of the orphan trains, where there are many accounts that one of the parents were still alive. Whether it was the mother or the father, it doesn't matter. And the account we're given is that the mother or father, for some reason, was incapacitated, and therefore the children had to be taken and sent to another family. And if you think about this, and if you think about why this effort would continue, this is where the true insidious nature of the orphan trains is revealed. This is how we destroy a people from establishing an identity and their own individuality. And you'll find plenty of accounts, especially on public broadcasting service or public television, where they talk about how benign and altruistic the orphan trains were and how effective they were. They even have people that they interview who were actual members of the orphan trains, or those who rode the orphan trains, as they euphemistically say, and that they ended up with a good family, that they felt that they benefited from the situation. Even more interesting is that most of the people they interview claim that one of their birth parents were still alive, and yet for various reasons they had to leave. They were alcoholic, or they were suffering from some sort of depression, or there was some other reason. A lot of times, though, when you try to look up the accounts, there was no reason given for why the children were taken from their parents. And remember, this was in the later decades, 1850 to 1870. It seems pretty clear there were a lot of children who simply didn't have parents. But then after that, they seem to repeat the concept of the orphan train as a means of taking children from their parents. It's a theme that appears and reappears in our historical narrative, and it's a disturbing theme because it does contribute to the concepts of diaspora and dysphoria. It prevents people from forming the ability to establish their own identity, and it makes them even more reliant on indoctrination. And if you think about this, you see how effective this is as a tool of indoctrination. Because until these children were given families, they were also kept together. And we think about many of the great schools that children were taken to. We also think about some of the schools that we looked at in our earlier explorations, such as St. Coletta. And we have to wonder if they had a different purpose. Everything, we're told, started in New York, and specifically New York City. This is where all these orphans seemed to be in a vast number. Why just New York City? Or was it because New York City was simply the collection point for all of them? If you think about it, it's a major port, and towards the end of the Civil War and the other conflicts, it would make sense to have the children as orphans go there. And then they were transported to these states, namely the Midwest states, to supposedly work on the farm where there was a shortage of labor. But none of the people who were looking for jobs decided to go out to the Midwest. They just wanted to work as construction workers. I'm being a little facetious, but I'm also being serious at the same time, because this doesn't make any sense. It also doesn't make any sense from the aspect as to why the Midwest would seem underpopulated. We're told it's because it was settled, but then at the same time we see all these towns and all these cities that seem to come up from nowhere. Each of the states of the Midwest also has their own account of the orphan trains, and of course it's always supporting the narrative that this was a benevolent effort, that this was very altruistic, and this helped the children. And yes, I keep using that word altruistic because if we think about the grander aim of this, and the fact that we're told to think a certain way about this, we have to wonder, what's the true objective? And why was this something that was turned to again and again? Especially when we have numerous accounts of families who still had a parent that seemed to be perfectly capable of taking care of their children. This is also reflected more recently in the mainstream. There was a movie from 1979 called The Orphan Train, which you can still watch today, featured Glenn Close, and it was also featured on the very popular 1990s TV show, I'm not knocking it, Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman, a show that was carried entirely by the charisma of Jane Seymour. And the episode, in fact, was called The Orphan Train, where a group of orphans showed up in Colorado. No, not one of the states, but everything seemed to happen in Colorado if you ever saw that show. And Dr. Quinn decides to team up with the local reverend, and they're going to raise the children, and there goes the plot. Of course, it's resolved within 60 minutes, like many other TV shows. The real point behind this is the fact that you have this concept of the orphan train remaining within the memory of the United States. And yet it's pushed again that this was a very benevolent effort, that we were legitimately trying to help these children. And yet you see other accounts that conflict with that. And I'll start with the story of my great-grandparents. These are the photos from my family, my great-grandparents. The family that originally lived in Cincinnati from 1890 to 1910. Looking at old photos is always very intriguing because they tell a different story. The actual account that I have from my great-grandparents, though, is very difficult to ascertain. And you look at these old photos and sometimes it just makes you feel like you're in a completely different world, as though you're looking at people with familiar faces, and yet the world they're living in just seems very different. This wasn't that long ago. Over 120 years, 130 years at most in some of the photos. And I just wanted to show you what these original photos looked like. This is the photo of my great-grandparents at their wedding ceremony. And they were very happy, according to what accounts that we have, although it's very difficult. And I'll explain why in a moment, why it's difficult to ascertain what truly happened. There was only a few surviving family members that actually made it to the generation, or 2 generations before mine, my grandparents. And there was quite a tragedy that occurred. From what I understand, when they were married, they were very happy, and they were prepared to take their place in life, and they lived in Cincinnati initially. There Also the stories that my great-grandfather, pictured on the left here, was a very adventurous individual, and he was someone who had a very keen intellect and wanted to find answers in his life. Apparently he was someone who didn't necessarily accept the answers that he was given by others, and searched on his own. There's accounts of them going to several different World's Fairs or World's Expositions, to include the Chicago World's Fair, the Cincinnati World's Fair, and finally the St. Louis World's Fair in the early 20th century. However, the records are very difficult, and it's hard to say exactly what happened. They settled on a farm in Kentucky near Cincinnati, and that seemed to be where they lived and enjoyed their initial life. Initially, they had 3 children, and then it increased to 5 children as they were running the typical farm. Here's where the story starts to take an ominous turn. For reasons unknown, my great-grandmother suddenly died, and it's difficult to ascertain exactly why she died. There's nothing stating sickness. There's rumors of post-childbirth difficulties and the usual health aspects of that time. But nobody seems to know for sure, and there's no written account or anything in the news that survived to this day that tells me exactly what happened. The story gets even stranger when the fact that my great-grandfather, an adventurous individual and someone who was reputed to be very reliable, and most of the members of my family, if not all, and all the descendants from this branch of the family, they were all about family and all about going the extra distance to take care of family. Yet for some reason, my great-grandfather had all of his children taken away from him. There was nothing ever stated on an official reason for why this happened, why he would be unable to care for them, or why he'd be unable to move on. Subsequently, he was confined to the Central State Hospital in Louisville, Kentucky, where he spent the last 3 decades of his life. These were the last pictures that were taken of him, and this is from the 1940s. I can't get an exact date on the photo. And it was supposedly from the time that my grandmother was able to visit him and took these photos, and you actually see Central State Hospital right behind him here. I do look at his face, and I see that he seems to be content or at ease. And there was once a letter that he had written to his children, and yet I can't find that letter. I only have memories of it from my grandmother and her surviving sisters, and most of them have passed away now. Still, I wonder, why were his children taken away? What really happened? I only have more questions than answers. And that was the unfortunate tragedy of how his life ended, and how my grandmother and her sisters were put on a later version of the Orphan Train. The other thing that I found going through the photos was this strange postcard of the concourse at the Union Terminal in Cincinnati. You might recall it's the building we looked at in the exploration of Cincinnati that clearly inspired the Justice League building from the old Super Friends in the 1970s. Curious that this would be found in the effects that remained from my great-grandfather. This structure was not completed until the 1930s, and he was detained, and I'm going to use that word, in Central State Hospital in Louisville long before that. So why was there a postcard like this within his effects? It may not mean anything, but I have to wonder, is there some sort of clue about this? There's nothing that remains of his writings or his journals or even the letter that he wrote to his children after he was sent to Central State Hospital. So all I have to go on are clues, and I'm going to continue these explorations to try to find my own answers, because I feel there are many questions. We're also going to be looking more at the orphan trains, specific examples, and what effects they may have had from 1850 to 1870, and then their continuation in the 20th century. There's much more to explore with this, and yet it's clear we can see that this approach is still used even to this day with conflict, assimilation, and indoctrination. It seems to be the way that people are kept in line, and that people are not only given activities which they must focus on, but also how people are controlled through conflict, through their role in society, and then ensuring that they adhere properly to their role in society. These are aspects we're going to continue to explore as we go forward. Well, as always, ask questions, explore yourself, and you'll restore the world. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.